Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be analysing the artwork of Marvel Rivals. So recently I've been doing this series called Hunting for Inspiration, where we take a moment to appreciate the artwork and effort that goes into making games like this. I'm not going to be playing a match with other people today, we're just going to be talking about the style of the game, art-wise, because Marvel is quite interesting. Across the different projects, they allow for a wide range of different styles, in part because the licenses to make games and other merchandise and projects like this are handed out to a diverse range of teams, all of which might want to bring their own ideas to the table. For Marvel in particular, this is the kind of game where you get to play as some of your favorite heroes from comic books and the movies. What that does is it raises a challenge of how do you get people from both of these audiences interested, because not everyone that likes the comic books likes the films. And also, while keeping these things in mind, how do you make it appealing to a wider gaming community, a wider gaming audience? So I always find it interesting having a look at the art styles of stuff like this, because it then helps to reveal the kinds of choices that were made behind the scenes and also reveals the amount of effort that goes into it. So some of these characters here are recognizable from the films, things like the Winter Soldier, Wolverine, Spider-Man, Rocket Raccoon from Guardians of the Galaxy, and many more. Some of them are very unique in their style, whereas others seem a bit more derivative and kind of copy-pasted. For characters like Iron Man, it's quite interesting because they're so iconic from the movies. How do you make your own impression as a game developer while also making it familiar to people that are fans of the films? If we go to cosmetics, we see that the compromise was to create different variations of the character, in particular one that's more reminiscent of the films. However, despite it being reminiscent, it maintains this comic book style that the game is trying to project. So it's not identical, but it's close enough just to tickle that fan part of the brain that might make people want to buy this additional skin just to play on that memory of the films. This is also more work for the character artists. And one thing you'll notice that's interesting is that it's definitely trying to convey that comic book style. As we look along the right side of the character, we have this high contrast white and then occasional black lines that follow. It's interesting to note that the black lines here seem to appear when there are other environmental elements behind, almost as if like extra thought has gone into making it clear that there's a character in front of the scene. So it's eye-catching and very easy to identify, which is really important in like a hero shooter like this. Other characters like Rocket Raccoon have the same kind of thing happen. Rocket Raccoon is a character from Guardians of the Galaxy. If we go to the cosmetics, we'll see that there's a Guardians version of it. But again, it's not entirely the same as the movies. It's just they've added some visual elements that are more reminiscent of the films, in this case the jumpsuit. So it allows them to keep this unique visual identity for the game while also giving people what they want. Another interesting thing to notice is that while we've got that comic book highlighting here, it's not present everywhere on the character, particularly the weapon, which shows no example of that highlighting effect, but it is present on the jetpack. It's likely because the weapon is a separate object, and it may or may not be the case that that's a deliberate design choice. It's nice to see as well the integration of particle effects that are kind of left behind, as we can see that they're not rotating when they appear from the character weapon. So if I move that around, there comes a point where they're projected off and then they kind of become global in a way, and they just stayed there. So that's again a nice little attention to detail. In fact, the visual effects are quite impressive in this. We can take a look at some of that. Also here on the character select page, they've done a thing where it's almost like the comic books are coming to life, which I'm pretty sure is exactly what they were thinking of when they did this. If we hover over a character and then rotate the mouse around, we can see we get this parallax effect, which kind of makes you question, is it 2D or is it 3D? Because we could see where it could be 2D layers, but at the same time, it definitely looks three-dimensional. Now with this in mind, some characters are more unique than others, because if I scroll up, we see Jeff the Land Shark, one that's become a little bit viral recently, simply because it plays into the cute factor. I think they knew that every game needs a token cute character just to kind of tug on the cuteness, aggression, and heartstrings of the people that are into that. Again, there's some interesting physics element here of like, as you rotate, the character reacts. So in terms of the tail and also the collar piece here. Also, notice how the face tilts towards the camera as we rotate, just to try and get like the best framing for the character at all times. I'll do it again. Here we go. The face is tilting. That's pretty clever. Not everyone would think of that. And they, of course, went even further to do a furry suit version of the character just to try and tug on people's wallets. The thing is, it's interesting, though, that they have committed to a style that's, well, grand and expressive in many ways, and definitely conveys the comic book style. It's also limiting in others, which is why in some cases things look a bit samey. So I would say, like, the face of Magic and the face of Luna Snow and the face of Black Widow could all pretty much be exactly the same generic female face with slightly sharp figure, with just different makeup colors colors and hairstylings. It seems as though the form is pretty much similar across the board and just designed to be as kind of generically attractive as possible to attract the average player base. Now, that might come off as a bit harsh, but it's a big debate in the gaming community at the moment about, people trying to design female characters to be more realistic in terms of proportions, and then people being really unhappy with that because that's not what they buy the games for. Now, that's not a debate for here, but when we're talking about artistic choices, because remember, these things don't just appear out of nowhere. There are very specific design choices for absolutely everything we see on the screen. There's a conversation, there's a meeting, there's a choice that goes in behind, like how much of the belly do you show? How is this painted for the contours? How much of the thigh do you show? What kind of pose are they going to make? Again, I'm not here to say whether that's a good or bad thing. I'm saying that if you're an artist, these are the things which are discussed to fit a purpose. Now, it's not restricted to female characters. It also applies to male ones. So just to be fair, the face of Winter Soldier and the face of Wolverine, again, could just about be the same face, but maybe with Wolverine, they've painted on a few more contours. So it's interesting to look at, while there is some great variety in the character design, especially with Venom and Jeff the Shark, where these things seem to have been extremely bespoke in their design and their presentation and the creation of extra particle effects to make the physicality make sense. In other areas, things feel a bit more generic. It is interesting, though, that while we do have the hyper slim female aesthetic, they have tried to go for a slightly more plus size squirrel girl, I think probably to try and fend off the argument that everyone looks the same. But again, always with the belly and thigh, always visible. Okay, so let's hop into the practice range environment and take a little look at the effort that's gone into the environment design. So I'm running around as Rocket Raccoon in a Wakanda-inspired environment. So if you don't know anything about the Marvel series, it's basically what if the African styling meets something futuristic. So you end up with these interesting geometric motifs that play into a lot of structural elements and parts of technology, while also keeping the very metallic and clean and vibrant styling of something a bit more futuristic. Notice an interesting design choice on the floor here, how we have a rather generic-looking tiled floor area, but then we have random pieces of geometry and scratch-like marks adding some extra detail. That's something I haven't really seen done before because it doesn't necessarily make sense just having random pieces of geometry, but it doesn't have to. It seems like it fits in just having this semi-random styling, adding a little bit of roughness variation and discoloring, because realistically, who's going to stop and look at it and wonder if it makes sense? Me. No, but the point is, it doesn't really matter. It's quite nice though, and another thing to keep in mind is that they've put effort into making things destructible. And sometimes it's quite hard to tell whether the destructible pieces are entirely the same every time, or whether there's a couple of different variations based on where the player shoots. When I shoot the center, things seem to break into more parts, but when I shoot the edge sometimes, it looks like they break into slightly larger parts where the middle is untouched. So there's a little bit of ambiguity there, which is great because it makes it a bit more believable. But that's another thing that the 3D artists have to keep in mind when making these prop pieces. How are they going to break apart? We also get to notice here that highlight on the characters that we saw in the character selection screen that gives us that white and black comic book style around the border is not actually present on our character here. But that's okay because it means that we kind of get a stylistic clarity going, because if you're shooting at people and we've got things like these red markers to indicate who's a friend and who's an enemy, then having that extra highlight may be just a bit too visually busy. And also, as I take people out, we can see that we have these animated 2D elements on the side. Now, that's not to say you can't do that kind of stuff in 3D, because a lot of people do 2D animations in 3D software, especially if they're more comfortable with how the keyframing system works and general parametric type effects. But it's just one thing to note that it's hyper consistent with this comic book style, which makes it very visually appealing to play in. Another thing I like as I activate the alt here is this holographic element. So we're getting a mix of visual styles. Actually, to drive that home, let's look at this. We've got 2D visual effects, then 3D visual effects. And we can tell this is 2D because as I move the camera around, specifically if I move it up and down, we can see the effect rotate. And that's a representation of an effect being billboarded, meaning that it's pointing towards the camera all the time. So they really have gone for a combo of effects that needs to incorporate the work of 2D animation artists and 3D artists. Again, there are more 2D effects here, but they're stretched across 3D space, which is interesting. I also really like these environment pieces in the background, stuff that you don't necessarily need to put much detail in because no one's really going to look at them too intently. But there are interesting things to notice, like there's some very faint scratch marks there on that rock, which we also see present elsewhere in the environment, so I don't know why. It just kind of gives the storytelling maybe that we've had some strong monster or creature-like characters making their mark around here. But also as we look around, we can notice that on distant elements like the rocks here, we see these comic book-like shading stripes. So even in far-off elements that people won't really pay too much attention to, we're still getting that consistency with the art style. Now, this video is not sponsored, don't worry, but this game is free to play, so if there's anyone that wants to study an interpretation of a comic book style in 3D, then it's quite an interesting one to play around with. So I hope you've enjoyed this quick look at our little analysis of the art style of Marvel Rivals. There's actually quite a few things in here I could take inspiration from in terms of references, so I may come back to this. But yeah, thanks for watching everyone, stay safe, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.